Hello, welcome to the crisis cycle, the brain and executive function. I am Sonia Cornish.
And I'm Ryan Jeffrey.
We're glad that you have decided to take our training, and we hope that the information is valuable to you. By the end of this training, we will have identified the connections between the crisis cycle, brain function, and executive functioning. We will also have covered how to apply this knowledge to support emotional well-being in children. The agenda for this training is that, first of all, we will look at the etymology of the word crisis. We will look into brain function and the crisis cycle. Next, we'll look at executive function and the crisis cycle, and then we'll do a quick reflection and closing. To get started, we are going to focus our thinking on the crisis cycle with a quick write activity. Think and reflect on your prior knowledge, experiences, and perceptions in regarding the word crisis. Just take 2 minutes to jot down as many words as you can think of that relate to the word crisis. What are some words that come to mind? Crinin is rooted in Latin and traced back to Greece, where it means to judge or decide. It evolved into crisis as a medical Latin term in the early 17th century, where it meant decision or judge, and was used to refer to the turning point or decisive moment in a disease. At such a moment, the person with the disease could get better or get worse, as in it is a critical moment. It is interesting to look at the etymology of the word crisis, as its historical definitions could serve as a brain remap for how we work with students when they are in crisis. Based on how we use the word crisis today, if we consider an individual in crisis, we would often think about someone that is out of control, angry, unable to function, dangerous, fearful, for example. What if, when we encounter a person in crisis, we consider the historical definitions of the word? As a person moves through the crisis cycle, each part of the cycle requires the decisive action to either avoid a crisis or continue towards it. We all experience events within our day that trigger us towards escalating to a crisis. For the most part, we use strategies that we decide to use which calm us down, and it avoids complete escalation. During a time of crisis, children will often need significant support to use strategies and navigate difficult environments. Many children in the early stages of development lack the ability to make appropriate decisions as they escalate towards crisis, and they rely on us to identify the moments and lend the appropriate support. A person in crisis is experiencing an event that the brain perceives as adverse. For example, a child with dyslexia may begin to escalate through the crisis cycle when asked to read out aloud. Or a child with autism may experience intense emotions when they are in an overstimulating environment. Our world presents us with triggers that require us to respond, and we decide how to proceed with that situation. For adults, an example of an everyday crisis that we encounter could be an individual navigating the busy traffic of Northern Virginia, or a person that may lose their employment and the ability to buy food. These events are authentic circumstances that can prompt an emotional response in a person. As you can see, there are many examples of people in crisis throughout society. When we switch on the news, there are often reports of one crisis after the next. Crises amongst nations, crises in the financial markets, crises amongst ourselves, crises during the lockdown. Somehow, as society has evolved, we've normalized the word crisis as something that is perceived as out of control, angry, something to run away from, or negative. And it has caused us to move away from its original use as a moment of decision-making and a hope for a return to normalcy. When we are helping our children, whose days are often impacted by many difficult moments that can trigger their progression through the crisis cycle, we must understand that their decision-making process is being impacted by the way their brain functions through the crisis cycle. Different parts of the brain come into play as the person proceeds through the stages of crisis. At baseline, our brains are calm as they are accessing their neocortex. The neocortex is involved in higher functions as a sensory perceptions, motor commands, and spatial reasoning. A child's view of time is extended. They should be able to understand yesterday, tomorrow, and even next month. Their ability to think abstractly is intact, and their behaviors should appear normal. At the trigger phase, our brains are at arousal point as they are accessing their subcortex. The subcortex is involved in complex activities such as memory, emotion, pleasure, and hormone production. Their sense of time becomes more restricted to understanding and related to days and hours. Behavior becomes more concrete in nature as they are more vigilant, and behaviors are more centered around avoidance of the trigger. At the lower escalation phase, our brains enter the limbic system where emotions rule the moment. The limbic system is the part of the brain that deals with emotions and memory. It is also involved in reinforcing behavior in response to emotional stimuli. We experience a sense of alarm and view time in terms of hours and minutes. Thinking can be very emotional, and behaviors can be either very resistant or compliant. At the higher escalation phase, our responses enter the midbrain. Motor movement, auditory, and visual processing are impacted at this stage. We are experiencing a sense of fear and are reactive in thinking. Behaviors are more defiant and dissociative and not necessarily connected to the actual situation at hand. We're experiencing time in terms of minutes or seconds. At the crisis phase, people revert to the brainstem. The brainstem controls the most basic of functions such as breathing, heart rate, etc. At this stage, they can become either highly aggressive or freeze. Think about the fight or flight syndrome that we experience. They lose all sense of time and are in survival mode. At the de-escalation phase, our goal is to access the limbic system and allow for compliance. At the stabilization phase, our goal is to access the subcortex and allow them to process what's happened. At the post-crisis drain phase, our goal is to access the neocortex and return to more normalized behavior. When you consider what the crisis cycle is and what happens to the brain, what are some new and emerging beliefs and assumptions in your thinking? Just take a couple of minutes to think about it.
So, what is executive functioning? Executive functioning is a set of mental processes that work together to regulate student behavior, your child's behavior, so that they can control their behavior and reach their learning goals. It works to their best interest to have strong executive functioning skills and to have this set of mental processes developed. And specifically, it's a set of 6 mental processes that we're going to review right now. So as we take a look, we have 1, metacognition, 2, working memory, 3, goal-directed persistence, 4, goal-directed attention and focus, 5, self-control, and 6, cognitive flexibility shift. Now, let's look at number 1, metacognition. Metacognition is your child's ability to think about their own thinking. Does your child have reflective skills where they're able to look at their behavior and determine whether they should do something different next time, or whether they should continue with the same course? Well, we're going to talk about how to develop these metacognition skills. What about working memory? Do you ever give your child a simple direction and they don't follow it? Well, sometimes working memory allows us to know the steps in a process. And if we give our child a direction that has more than one step and their working memory isn't as strong, then they could not carry out a direction simply because they don't remember all the steps and their working memory isn't as strongly developed. So we may want to hone in on how to develop their working memory. Goal-directed persistence is your child's ability to block out all distractions, hone in on a task, and focus on their learning. How many times during virtual learning or in-person learning is your child going to encounter distractions? Many times. A phone can ring. They can get a surprise visitor. A dog can bark. A phone can ring. Anything can happen that can throw them off track. But if they have goal-directed persistence, they'll be able to focus and carry on with their learning to get more information to be able to perform better in their class. Next, you have goal-directed attention and focus. This allows them to be able to transition from one task to the next without getting confused or losing themselves or wanting to stay with this one activity when the rest of the class has moved on. And if this is not strong and developed, then what can happen is as they move from task to task, from maybe a teacher lecture or an activity where information is being shared, where now they're transitioning to where they have to share and they're not ready to do that. Or maybe it's a situation where there's a movement activity, it's fun, it's up pace, but now they're shifting to more of a calm mindfulness activity where they have to step down a little bit and they're unable to do that because this area is not as strong or developed. Well, there's various transitions that happen throughout the day, whether they're accessing virtual learning or they have hybrid learning in person. So the more that we can develop this area, the better they're going to be able to transition. Self-control. Self-control skills enable your child to be able to take a break when they need to get a sip of water, to take a walk, to do deep breathing, to do those things that will prevent them from escalating so high that they can no longer control their emotions and they just shut down. Or they have physical aggression and they lash out because their frustration is at such a high level. So helping our child to develop self-control skills will definitely be in their best interest. Next, we have cognitive flexibility and shift. And this is our child's ability to be able to bounce back after a disruption, after an unexpected visitor, after a fire drill, after they have connection issues with the internet and they're frustrated and they're unable to access their learning. That can be very frustrating. But if they have strong cognitive flexibility shift capabilities, then they're able to bounce back, get right back on track without maybe 30 minutes or hours of just being knocked out of the game and unable to regroup and get their bearings. So it's in our child's best interest to develop these skills. But how do we help them develop these skills when all the situations that can interfere with the development of these skills cause your child to escalate, to go from an emotional baseline to escalating until they get to a crisis. They stay in this crisis longer than we want them to. And then we have to wait till after this crisis occurs until they're able to come back down and de-escalate and come back down to a baseline. What we're going to transition and talk about now is how we help our students to develop these skills through them going from a baseline, escalating, being in a crisis, and coming back down. So what you have on your screen here is this crisis cycle. So let's talk about the executive functioning skills that we just referenced and how we can help to support the development of these skills as our children are going through a crisis situation. Because in all fairness, this pandemic has been challenging to our children. They have been forced to be in a situation where they've been isolated in some cases, where there's been many transitions, where they're having to access virtual learning, hybrid learning. They're having to learn how to wear their mask and wash their hands several times a day. They're doing good just to hang in there right now. So we have to give each other a little bit of grace during this period. It's been a challenge to all of us. But let's look at your child at their best when they're at an emotional baseline. This is the time to help our students develop cognitive flexibility and shifting by discussing plans with them of how we're going to handle unexpected change. What's going to be our plan when the telephone rings, when mommy or daddy is in a meeting and you have to access virtual learning by yourself? What's the plan for creating a visual cue and a routine? A lot of times having a visual schedule, and your child's teacher has experience with creating visual schedules. We have to partner together in education, and maybe some of the tools that are being used in the classroom, you can use some of those tools at home. Creating a consistent and predictable environment to the best that you can help your child to develop these cognitive flexibility and shifting skills. When there is a trigger and they move from baseline, their goal-directed focus and attention skills are going to be challenged because there's things that are challenging their ability to focus. So having regularly scheduled check-ins where we help keep our child on track so that any distraction in the learning environment doesn't throw them completely off. Checking in with them on a regular basis, whether that's every 45 minutes, every 30 minutes. We know the natural rhythm and time clock that our child is on. Being able to coach them through difficult steps. Having a visual timer or a checklist. A lot of times when our child is having difficulty, maybe they might be presented with too much at one time, we can just help them to focus on that one thing. That can be through a checklist, that can be with the use of a timer where we set a timer for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and after that time goes off, we give them a little bit of a reprieve. Next, there is the escalation phase. The lower escalation phase is where they're starting to get escalated now. So the things that they were able to do at baseline, the way we were able to help them handle unexpected change, the way that we role played with them, and we know that they have the skills to be able to do this. Well, now when they're escalated, they're not as easily able to access these skills. Their working memory is now being challenged. So if we have a visual cue, if we have a prompt to help guide them through this, then we help them develop their working memory. Then if they escalate a little further and they're losing a little bit of their self-control, if we are in control of ourselves and we don't escalate with our child, which is easier said than done, because a lot of times they can tell when we're on edge, but as they go up the cycle, if we can project that we're actually coming down, that we're calm, we're letting them know that it's okay to feel frustrated. We want to empathize with them. I understand you're upset right now. I understand that you're embarrassed right now, whatever the feeling is. We want to present an option A or an option B calming activity that we've identified at baseline. And you know what activities help to calm your child down, whether it's them listening to music, whether it's them playing with Play-Doh, or whether it's them going on a brief walk for 5 minutes, give them an option A or option B, because they can't think of it during a time when they're so escalated. So hopefully that helps to de-escalate them. If this doesn't work and they go into a crisis phase where they're becoming physically aggressive, just know that this is normal for kids when they're in crisis, and they'll do one of three things. There's 3 Fs. They'll either fight, flight, or freeze. And either one of these things can be a risk to safety. So what we want to do is we want to have the least amount of interaction necessary for safety. So what this may mean is that, well, number one, we want to project emotional calm, but also we want to let them know through our body language that they are safe, because we are calm, we are in control of ourselves. So give them the space that they need, give them the time that they need, keep them as safe as possible during this time, but just know that when they're in this stage, they just need the window of time necessary to pass through it before they reach the next stage, which is de-escalation. And during the de-escalation phase, we just provide a low demand activity, very much to when they're escalated. Very similar to when you gave them an option A or an option B, this is the time to give them a very low demand, calming activity. You just want to soothe them, because if we don't give them enough time in de-escalation, we're helping them to develop self-control here. But if we don't give them enough time, they could go right back into the crisis phase. So as we have them do these low demand activities in the de-escalation phase, we're helping them to develop those self-control skills, because eventually, after the repetition of doing this over and over, they'll naturally access these activities on their own. How do we know that they're ready to transition from de-escalation to now being able to process and talk about their feelings, which is more of the metacognition skills? We know by giving them simple compliance checks. We just ask them to follow a simple direction: push in your chair, give me your high five, play Simon Says, do something like that. And if they comply with a simple one-step direction, they're now ready to move to the next phase and process. And through a journal, through discussion, through reflection, you just want to hit these main points. What was your behavior? We want them to develop an awareness. What will you do next time? We want to help them to problem solve. Are you ready to return to the learning activity? You know, just these simple things to help them reflect helps develop those metacognitive abilities. So as they move to the next phase, after they've processed, now they're at the post-crisis phase. And naturally, the physical and the mental fatigue can take a toll. It can be a challenge to their working memory, and they need help knowing the steps to get back on track. How do I return back to the learning environment? Because our goal now is for them to be able to return to normal. We want to just prepare them and help prompt them through this. Whether you use a mnemonic device or some sort of template, you can certainly access this through the school, because your child's teacher has a lot of tools. The school has a lot of tools that they use to help get a child back on track when they're having challenges with emotional regulation. So just using these different techniques throughout the phases of the crisis cycle, you can actually support and develop your child's executive functioning skills as they are challenged with these, as they escalate through the crisis cycle. So let's take a self-assessment real quick to see where you are with your learning. How would you describe yourself right now? I know this was a lot of information. Do you feel like you're a novice? You understand some of the key concepts, but your ability to apply it might be a little challenged. You might say, well, I've pinpointed one area that I need to work on with my child. I want my child to develop self-control or metacognition or being able to transition better. I just not sure how to apply it. It's okay. We're just developing an awareness right now. Do you feel like you're a practitioner? You understand most of the concepts? You might get stuck on 1 or 2 points, but for the most part, you do feel like you could take this information and coach your child through the steps to strengthen their executive functioning. Do you feel like you're an expert? You know all of the 6 areas well. You can help your child. You can help another parent. I encourage you to help another parent who may be struggling with their child to develop these skills, because we're all a community. We're here to help one another. We're here to strengthen each other. Each one can reach one. So let's just reflect. How can you apply this information from today to your parenting practices? And I don't want you to get overwhelmed with this information. I just want you to think of one change, one commitment that you want to make that's going to support the vision you have for your child. What's that one change that was triggered from the training today? How might you know that you're on target with your goal? And what support do you need? Reach out to us, because your school community, your child's teacher and principal and counselor, they're all here to support you as your child develops and strengthens their executive functioning skills. So as you develop your own plan, as you look through this cycle and you think about how it applies to your child, be encouraged that this is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but incremental progress can catch momentum, and your child can make unbelievable progress with their executive functioning skills. So I definitely want to commend you for being here, for investing the time to develop your skills, to develop your child's skills, to help them. Thank you so much for being here. And we're here together to partner with each other. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.